This presentation is about learning styles and about debunking learning styles by Megan Johnson. So to start off, what is a learning style? So a learning style is the idea that everybody has a different mode in which they learn, and that a teacher's job is to differentiate each lesson to teach each student in the one way that they learn. And this, I would be careful not to mix this up with Howard Gardner's multiple intelligences, although it sounds like there's some overlap used in their vocabulary, but their ideas are actually a little bit different. Within learning styles, there's also an idea that learners can take a learning style inventory to learn which mode works for them. And then, like I said, it's the teacher's job to then teach in a visual style to the visual student and an auditory way to the auditory learner, so that the teacher can kind of unlock the way in which that student learns so they can transfer knowledge. So a little bit more about the learning styles. Dr. David Kolb was a Harvard graduate. He got his master's and doctorate from Harvard in the 60s, and then he started his work in the 70s and created this idea of learning styles. And so here's Dr. Kolb. Later, Walter Barb had this term VAK, which was for visual, auditory, and kinesthetic learners. And I think I've seen this poster around our school recently, and it's something that I learned in college in the early 2000s, and I still see it being used in classrooms today. So Neil Fleming then took that idea of VAK and added the R in there, and that R is for reading and writing, or verbal. There's a lot of different ways that this information is visually shared, and there's like 71 different methods now being shared, and one new piece that's been added is that social versus independent learner. And like I said, with over 71 different models out there, here's one, and you can see that they get pretty complex pretty fast. But the VAK one, the most simplified one, is the one that I most often see in classrooms. So now let's look at those ideas and learn the newest information. So in 2009, this study talked about that the previous work done with learning styles, that work was not scientifically valid. There were not random groups that were then, if I took all the visual people, it's not like they taught some visually, some auditory, and some kinesthetic to see if they learned better in any mode. Actually, the research that was done, there was no difference in the way that people learned. And it kind of made me think of soup and salad. So maybe I have a preference. Maybe I really like to learn visually, but it doesn't mean that I'm not learning if the teaching is being done in an auditory way. I just have a preference. So like soup and salad, both of those are really nutritious, and I might like soup better, but it doesn't mean that if I eat the salad that I'm not getting the nutrients. And so this was from a different source. This was from the Washington Post. And again, it just talks about there was no persuasive evidence that the learning style analysis produces more effective outcomes than a one-size-fits-all approach. So in one model, we have a teacher that's taking the learning and trying to reteach in 4 modes, yet that didn't have any more bearing on the learning than if the teacher has a one-size-fits-all approach that's being delivered to all of the students. So if we rethink learning styles a little bit, every learner has different styles within them, and some of ours are stronger and weaker, but just because I'm a visual learner, that does not mean I'm also not an auditory learner or a kinesthetic learner. It just means that I might have a preference, but that we all have all those pieces within us. And learning styles has really been focused on the input, how the information is getting to the student, but it made me really think about what about the student information back to the teacher to show what they know. I wonder if there's some work done, if there's been some research there, or if maybe that's something that could be looked at, is not just how the information is getting to the student, but if we all learn in all ways, but I'm still a visual, maybe I like visual learning, maybe I need to show what I know visually, but it doesn't mean I need to learn from the teacher visually. It also made me think a little bit about cross-modal and I think that's the term. I took a class several years ago, and one aspect of the class was about if I learn through text, but I show what I know with a video, then really the learning has taken place at a different level or a deeper level than if I have to transfer the information from one mode of learning to another way to show what I know. So I'd be interested in doing a little bit more research there. So after looking up information about learning styles and then debunking them, I looked through Benedict Carey's book to see the overlap and see if there were some takeaways that could be used in a classroom in a practical way. So personalization was really the idea behind learning styles. And I think personalization is still key, but maybe just in a different way. So I wrote up this slide and then afterwards found this infographic that really seems to cement my thinking as well. So that if students think differently, they have different intelligences, doesn't mean they just have one, but they have multiple. But they also have different interests, backgrounds and cultures, abilities as well as disabilities that we really need to teach to the whole student. And if I can connect to an interest or a hobby that a student has, if I can work on those relationships, that's one way that personalization can really be strong. A second idea was just about teaching styles and variety. So it doesn't mean that I have to just teach visually to the visual student and an auditory way to the auditory student, but just that I have that variety that I'm teaching to all of my students. That I hope that I just don't go up and talk nonstop to my class, but that I do have visuals and maybe I have kids move around when that's appropriate, but that I have that variety that I'm presenting to all students. And Carey talked a little bit in his book about highlights that text only versus an image only. In an experiment that if just the picture was shown versus just the text was shown, that with the picture, the long-term increase in knowledge continued versus just text. So visuals, I think, do have a different effect on learning, but one thing Carey didn't talk about was if they combined those two, the image and the text, into one, what happened with the long term of learning. So Carey also talks a lot about environment, that it's important for students to learn in multiple places, inside, outside, upstairs, downstairs, and that's why I have this tree here, because it just reminded me that the wider the range in the environment, it seemed like the wider area in the brain that was being involved and that the learning, the retrieval was better. And Carey also talks about just within the one environment that maybe most of the learning is happening, that it's a really rich environment, which again talked about variety, having music, and just a really inclusive learning space. So slide number 3, choice. So like I said, learning style really really focused on how the teacher presented to the student, but maybe where the choice needs to happen is how the student presents the information back to the teacher. And we already talked a little bit about that cross-modal idea. Carey also references the power of mixed practice sessions, that schoolwork is often text-based, but mixing up the modes improves learning by increasing that transfer. And lastly, just mixing it up. So we talked about mixing it up for a teacher to have that variety in how they share with students, and for students to have the choice in the different modes how they present back to the teacher, but maybe really focusing also on practice. And gamification has been growing, gaining more momentum lately in the last several years, and that it really does include many different modes simultaneously. It's very visual. Sometimes there's text mixed in. There's some kinesthetics involved. And there's also this immediate feedback, which is not really related to learning styles, but is something that Carey brings up quite a bit, that immediate feedback, that refocusing. And so I was kind of interested in how gamification plays not into just learning styles, but in modes and variety. And then those are my resources. And so this presentation was about learning styles and debunking those myths, and then trying to find some information that could be practical advice in a current classroom.